No, I'm not Kevin Rudd. Sorry to disappoint you, but he'll be here momentarily after my brief remarks and after a brief introduction by a couple of our Australian students. My name is Jared Cohon. I'm the president of Carnegie Mellon, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this very special occasion. We're very honored to have with us today the Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. Traveling with him today is his wife, Therese Rain, who's also a clinical psychologist. He's also with him is the Honourable Wayne Swan, the Treasurer of Australia, and the Honourable Dennis Richardson, Australia's Ambassador to the United States. Of course, as we know, the Prime Minister is here to attend the G20 event, which will be opening just a few minutes after he finishes speaking here. Among the G20 countries, Australia stands out for us here at Carnegie Mellon in terms of the relationship we enjoy with the country. We have 58 students from Australia. I would have expected that would get a cheer from the Australian students. Our Heinz College has a campus in Adelaide in the state of South Australia, a program that opened in 2006. At the time, we were the first foreign university ever to be granted the permission to offer its own degree programs and its own degree in Australia, an honor that we appreciate very much. Since then, we've graduated more than 130 students who have gone on to have a big impact in Australia and in the other countries they're from. I want to take this opportunity to thank the Prime Minister and his government for their outstanding support, especially a really admirable program that Australia has called AusAid Scholarships, which allows students from developing countries to study at Australian universities and even Carnegie Mellon University in Australia. I also want to take the opportunity to thank the government of South Australia and its Premier, Mike Rann, who's been our great supporter from the beginning. What we're doing in Adelaide, I want you to know, is something that lines up very well with the Prime Minister's vision for what he calls world-class public service in the 21st century. He's very committed to education as a way to prepare public servants and something that he sees that requires attention, and we're delighted to be part of that vision. A second area in which Australia and Carnegie Mellon share strong interest is robotics. We consider there to be 3 great field robotics centers in the world. 2 of them happen to be in Australia: the Australian Centre for Field Robotics at the University of Sydney, and the CSIRO has an autonomous systems laboratory at their ICT center. The third, of course, is here at Carnegie Mellon, the center founded by Red Whittaker, the great robotics pioneer, and one that we're very, very proud of. Those 2 centers in Australia and ours here enjoy a very warm relationship and collaboration, which is growing all the time. And finally, a third area of common interest is global warming. And here I want to take a moment to congratulate the Prime Minister, who's been among the most outspoken and most forceful heads of government in the world when it comes to global warming. And unlike the heads of most governments in the world, he has made actual commitments, something I think we should all be grateful for. His leadership has had a big impact. An area of particular interest to Australia is carbon capture and sequestration, an area that we're especially strong in here. And in fact, our colleague, Ed Rubin, was the lead author on the carbon sequestration chapter in the IPCC report that received the Nobel Peace Prize, in which he shared. For all these reasons, we're especially pleased to have the Prime Minister with us today. I hope most of you will be able to stay for the distinguished panel discussion that will be held right after the Prime Minister's speech, a panel discussion on the topic of globalization, technology innovation, and the economy. And now, to introduce the Prime Minister, I'm pleased to introduce to you Matthew Craig, a graduate student in the Heinz College, and Patrick Bourke, a graduate student in engineering. Gentlemen, please.
Carnegie Mellon is a truly global university with connections and alumni across the world. And one of the most significant connections is in my hometown of Adelaide in Australia. In 2006, Carnegie Mellon, with the support of the Australian government and the South Australian government, established Heinz College Australia. Now, Australia has a long history of pragmatic and socially responsible public policy, and the Heinz College is an excellent fit there, and the relationship has benefited both. In fact, it's this relationship which has brought me here today. I arrived here just 4 weeks ago after studying at the Australian campus since 2008, and I was attracted to the university by the reputation of the university, but also by the way that this education could benefit my local community. While studying, I've also been working with the South Australian government and seen firsthand how directly relevant and beneficial the Carnegie Mellon experience is to Australia. I've also seen the benefit to Carnegie Mellon by expanding its reach and attracting new students from around the world. Now, this relationship between Carnegie Mellon and Australia is close, it's expanding all the time, and ultimately it's what's brought the Prime Minister here to speak to us today.
Like many here, I was initially attracted to Carnegie Mellon based on this institution's reputation in computer science and engineering, fields that in recent decades have profoundly changed the world in which we live. During my time here, however, I have witnessed that same drive to innovate, not only in the areas in which Carnegie Mellon presently stands proud, but those that will profoundly impact the world in future decades. Many of the people here are the best in the world at what they do. But more than that, I am often struck by their sense of community and willingness to work with others, both within and outside their own areas of expertise and around the world. Indeed, this was very clearly demonstrated to me when, shortly after coming to Carnegie Mellon came to Adelaide, opening one of several new campuses worldwide. It is such interdisciplinary approaches and a strong desire to cooperate that we must bring to bear if we are to resolve many of the issues being discussed this week. We are fortunate in today's keynote address to hear from the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Kevin Rudd, who possesses a unique perspective on these issues. Mr. Rudd was elected the 26th Prime Minister of Australia in November 2007 and has been a vocal advocate for the environment, education and global cooperation. It is my pleasure to introduce, on behalf of the Australian and the entire Carnegie Mellon community, the Prime Minister of Australia, the Honourable Mr. Kevin Rudd.
Thank you very much for that very warm welcome, and to Dr. Cohon, President of Carnegie Mellon University, and Mrs. Cohon, Mr. Tim McNulty, Associate Vice President for Government Relations, Dr. Randy Bryant, Dean of the School of Computer Science, other members of the faculty and staff, Dr. Amaya Krishnan, Dean of the Heinz College and Heinz College Australia, students and faculty of Carnegie Mellon, and if I could thank from the outset the Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon communities for their support for this event. Thank you for this warm invitation to this great city and to this great university. This is my first time to Pittsburgh. This is my first time to this university. So, as a very proud, self-proclaimed nerd, I sat down last night to Google a little about what I was about to come and discover over here in Pittsburgh. And knowing that I'd be speaking to a room full of nerds, I thought you'd appreciate that. It's now 250 years, I'm advised, since the British ordered the construction of Fort Pitt at the forks of the Ohio River in November of 1758, naming the settlement between the rivers Pittsburgh, which in time, of course, became Pittsburgh. And it was George Washington himself who, only 5 years before then, recommended the junctions of these rivers, and I quote him, well situated for a fort. And Washington, with an early and keen eye for real estate, observed it was, and I quote him again, very convenient for building. Of course, it was in these parts that Major Washington began his military career in the French and Indian War, before subsequently rising to the generalship of the Continental Army and, following the success of the Revolutionary War, to the presidency of the infant republic Had Washington been less successful in his military exploits out here in the 1750s, it's worth pondering whether the Continental Congress would have turned to him to lead the Continental Army 20 years later. And absent Washington's generalship, would the American revolutionaries have ever prevailed? You do toughen them up out here in the western parts of Pennsylvania. But with a local football team called the Pittsburgh Steelers, would you expect anything less? These were momentous times in America's history. Momentous times which shaped not only your own country's future, but also, indirectly, my country as well. For once Washington had prevailed over Cornwallis at Yorktown, the British lost their American colonies as a dumping ground for British convicts, and so instead... Your mind has raced ahead, I can tell. And so instead set about identifying an alternative and appropriate piece of real estate to deal with the detritus of the British justice system. And so was born the new convict settlement of Sydney. Its main street, Pitt Street, bearing the same name as this city, in both cases deriving from the great political dynasty of the same name that so comprehensively dominated mid-Georgian British politics. Of course, the moral of the story is simple. We should all blame the British for everything. Of course, had Washington been less successful in the Revolutionary War, my own criminal forebears would probably have ended up in these colonies, rather than in Australia. But as President Clinton remarked to me earlier this week, one of the clear delineating lines between the settled history of Australia and America is that America got the Puritans and Australia got the criminals. Although the President said he was still wondering who got the better deal. Think about it. This great university, Carnegie Mellon, also happens to be as old as the Commonwealth of Australia itself. Founded in 1900 by the great industrialist Andrew Carnegie, this university has grown to become one of the great American universities. Recognised for its world-class arts and technology programs, Carnegie Mellon has become a global research university of more than 4,000 faculty staff, 10,000 students and 70,000 alumni. Carnegie Mellon also, as has been mentioned today, operates in Adelaide, South Australia, and is already making a great contribution to higher education in Australia. And that, I presume, that poster over there of Andrew Carnegie is what he looks like from down under. I had to ask what it was when I came in. The university prides itself on its innovation and as a result has written for itself a large place in America's future. This university, in so many respects, embodies Pittsburgh's tale of two cities. It was Andrew Carnegie who began the steel industry in the 1870s, making Pittsburgh for the next 100 years the steel capital of America and the world. But the truth of economic history is that nothing ever stays the same. Nothing ever stands still. As the steel industry began to close down during the last quarter century, it was Carnegie's university, rather than his steel company, which provided a transformational vehicle for the old city of heavy industry to become the new city of the future, one grounded in the globalising knowledge economy of the 21st century. Pittsburgh is therefore not just famous for its place in economic history, but also for the transformation it has undergone to secure its economic future. Nobody should underestimate how tough the job of transformation has been for a city like Pittsburgh. My advisors tell me that watching the Steelers, the Penguins and the Pirates play their respective sports, which I'm reliably informed in this order are football, hockey and baseball, you have the privilege of seeing right up close and personal the spirit of this city on very physical and public display. By the way, we in Australia do appreciate our contact sport as well, so we have no problems with that. But I doubt that any culture or city on earth could compete with a city such as this, that could boast the Steelers, the Penguins and the Pirates on the one hand, and Andy Warhol, Gene Kelly and Perry Como on the other. Florence, eat your heart out. This is the Australian idea of a truly Renaissance city. The people of Pittsburgh have demonstrated themselves to be resilient, adaptable and creative. The city is in many respects a living essay for the capacity of America as a nation to constantly reinvent itself, to be in a permanent state of self-renewal. The city has known instinctively that you cannot insulate yourself from change, because no city, no country and no economy can ever do that. It's also why cities like Pittsburgh have a message for America and for the world, as they confront the new wave of fundamental change that is sweeping across the globe in the form of climate change. And specifically, the ideas, the systems and the technologies that the global economy will need to adapt to this existential economic and environmental threat that confronts our common future. But the core challenge is essentially the same, namely this: how to convert adversity into opportunity, how to convert threat into possibility, and how to deploy the technologies which now lie within our reach and the finance necessary to deploy them, not only to deal with climate change, but also to create the new skills, the new jobs, and the new industries for the American and global economies of the 21st century. And it is on this subject that I wish to address my remarks today. This afternoon, on the eve of the G20 summit, the major economies of the world are gathering here in Pittsburgh. Their agenda is broad, but essentially goes to two sets of fundamental threats to our common future: the global financial crisis, as well as the looming crisis that is climate change. It is fitting, therefore, that we meet in Pittsburgh because both these crises represent transformational opportunities for the future. Transformational opportunities for the world, just as you have succeeded in transforming this great city. For the global financial crisis, the challenge is to respond creatively to the systemic risks we have confronted over the last 12 months, not to assume we will simply return to a business-as-usual approach, but as a global economic system to embrace fundamental economic and financial regulatory reforms to secure our collective economic future. We need to reform the rules of the financial system. We need to reform the institutions of global financial and economic governance. More broadly, we need to reform the institutions of wider global economic governance. We must now develop a sustainable growth strategy for the long term, not just to better coordinate macroeconomic policy for the future, better macroeconomic coordination to prevent the re-emergence of the unsustainable global imbalances that fueled the global crisis and that has seen tens of millions of working families across the world lose their jobs. But beyond avoiding another crisis, our parallel challenge is this: how to generate the economic growth and the jobs of the future, given that the debt-driven consumption model of the past is unlikely to be trusted anymore. Because if we fail to find a new growth model, we face the prospect of lower global growth and less jobs for the future. In other words, a global growth cap which, absent other growth generators, could be as large as $6 trillion out of a global economy of $63 trillion US. The numbers suggest, therefore, that this is a central economic problem, not a marginal economic problem, and a central economic problem for us all. So what, therefore, will the new platform for global growth be for the future? To begin with, a successful conclusion of the global free trade round is one obvious candidate, a result which the Peterson Institute has calculated could produce $750 billion worth of additional global GDP. A second possibility is the great wave of global productivity growth and new business development that will come from the digital revolution, which is one reason why the Australian government is now, as a part of our fiscal stimulus strategy to deal with the global recession, now laying out a national high-speed broadband network at 100 megabits per second to 90% of our country, fibre optic to the premises, fibre optic to the home, to help turbocharge our economy through the 21st century. A third real possibility for global growth and jobs for the future is the transformation of the global economy to a lower carbon future. In other words, to turn the threat of climate change into a great transformational economic opportunity. At Pittsburgh, the G20 will deal with how to transform the global economy to a lower carbon world through carbon markets, global finance, both public and private, and the technology platforms necessary to give effect to global commitments to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Climate change indeed represents a great long-term threat to our planet. The agreed science warns us that the impact from climate change will be a clear threat to nations. By 2020, between 75 and 250 million people in Africa could be exposed to climate change-induced water shortages. Rain-fed agriculture yields may drop by up to 50% in some African countries. By 2050, rising sea levels could directly affect more than 1 million people in the river delta regions of Bangladesh, Vietnam and Egypt. Sea levels could rise by a metre or more, over 3 feet, by 2100. If the world does not act by the year 2100, global temperatures could rise by up to 6.4 degrees Celsius, that's more than 10 degrees Fahrenheit. These impacts will be felt right across the world. No respecter of nations, no respecter of peoples. Definitionally, a global challenge demanding a global response. But in areas like the Pacific Ocean, where many small island states sit only metres above the sea level, the impacts will be more immediate and more devastating. Without global action, the economic impacts of climate change will be substantial. Nicholas Stern found that doing nothing to address climate change will result in costs equivalent to reducing economic welfare by between 5 and 20% per person now and forever. What does all of this mean? It means, first and foremost, that we, the community of nations, must act. There is an overwhelming environmental and economic urgency to act on climate change. What we need to do is limit the amount of carbon getting into the atmosphere. According to the 4,000-member International Panel on Climate Change Scientists, one of whom I had the great privilege of meeting here this evening, a distinguished member of your faculty, its panel's report, agreed to by all governments, concluded that we need to stabilise the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere at 450 parts per million or lower, and we need to take action to limit the rise in temperatures to less than 2 degrees Celsius. Our response as a community of nations and as the economies of the world must be grounded in the science. We will only be able to achieve our objective if we act collectively to move to lower carbon economies. This move will require decisive action based by real leadership and founded on strong science. We need the right international and national agreements, we need the right mechanism to finance the transition, and we need to develop and deploy the best technology to effect that transition. The foundation of all this is establishing the carbon markets to ensure emissions reductions are achieved more efficiently. We need to get the international systems in place to enable this outcome. To do that, we need to make sure that we get a positive result from the United Nations Copenhagen meeting in December. In the lead up to the meeting, we need to use every path at our disposal to build the international consensus in the lead up to that conference. We also need to take big decisions, many of which only leaders can take. We need to take every opportunity to take the discussion forward where we have leaders gathered together in one place at one time. We did that at the Major Economies Forum meeting in Italy in July, and we need to do that again over the next day or so here in Pittsburgh. On top of international agreements, we also need, each of us, to put a price on carbon. Putting a price on carbon will create incentives to move to lower emitting activities, including in energy generation. For Australia, we have designed a carbon pollution reduction scheme aimed to do just that. Our objective is to have our scheme passed by the Australian Parliament before the Copenhagen meeting. We believe that nations should go to Copenhagen not just with targets, but with the means to achieve those targets as well. The key idea is that international action and domestic action must be linked to ensure that we actually deliver the results, the emissions reductions that are needed. Greenhouse gas reductions do not occur because we sign an international agreement. Greenhouse gas reductions occur because of the action then taken on the ground, the finance then deployed, and the technology then deployed. The rules also need to be laid out now because investment decisions in the energy sector and the rest of the economy are long-term. Business certainty also demands we settle the rules of national carbon markets rapidly and then take action to link markets as rapidly as possible across the world. Furthermore, as the French President reminded us publicly this week at the United Nations, failure to adopt carbon markets will result in real pressure to impose retaliatory tariffs, environmental tariffs, to those countries that have, or from those countries that have. Climate change will have a real economic and financial cost. As with any cost, it has to be borne by someone. Climate finance is a critical piece of the global climate change solution. We all agree that developed economies and developed countries need to commit to concrete emissions reduction. But they will only commit to the ambitious targets we need to keep greenhouse gas concentrations to below 450 parts per million if they know that emerging economies are prepared to play their part in reducing emissions. But without financial support for transitional arrangements for the world's poorest countries, emerging economies have indicated that they cannot make commitments to climate change action. Each of these elements is integral to a global deal at Copenhagen. Without climate finance, both public and private, through carbon markets, emerging economies will not agree to verifiable commitments to reduce their emissions, and if emerging economies fail to shoulder their part of the future burden, developed economies are unlikely to agree to binding targets themselves. That is why in my address to the United Nations General Assembly last night, I argued for a grand bargain between developed and developing countries and economies at Copenhagen, linking targets and commitments with finance and technology. We do not know yet what it will all look like, this deal, this agreement. We will need to keep doing the hard policy work over the next 73 days to Copenhagen to work towards a solution on this question. I hope that the meetings this week, both here and at the United Nations in New York, will provide some of the political direction needed to drive this work along. So far, I have spoken about policy that will reduce national emissions and policy that will provide the financing to lock a deal into place. But in Pittsburgh and here at Carnegie Mellon University, I also want to speak about technology. I've just seen your robotics lab and some of the cutting-edge research that's going on and some of the potential applications to climate change, some of the potential applications to greenhouse gas emissions and their monitoring. It is innovation of this calibre that we are going to need to tackle climate change effectively. Climate change is caused by human activity. That human activity has been driven by technology, and technology will be a key part of the human activity that is now necessary to reduce climate change, by less carbon-intensive energy generation, and by energy efficiency, in which there will be a large part of the solution had as well. We can do things more efficiently, but we are not going to turn off the need for energy. Developed and developing countries alike need energy. They need it for their economic development. They need it for the lives of their citizens. The dilemma, therefore, we face is how do we reduce energy use and make energy cleaner? Energy efficiency potentially represents 30% of the total greenhouse gas reductions we will need for the future. This is a big number. Energy efficiency, therefore, represents an equally large potential generator of new jobs in high tech, in medium tech, and even in lower tech or no tech, labour-intensive work as well. Energy efficiency covers a wide spectrum of industry possibilities, including the fuel efficiency of cars, smart grids and meters at home and at the office, proper home insulation to reduce heating and cooling needs. For example, the fiscal stimulus strategy we are deploying in Australia at present to counter the global recession aims to ensure that every owner-occupied dwelling in Australia has ceiling insulation. A $3 billion plus program that aims to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by up to 50 million tonnes and on the way through create thousands of low-skilled jobs for people suffering from the recession. We are also using these temporary jobs to add on new training programs to upskill workers for employment elsewhere once this fiscal program is complete. We also have to use energy more efficiently, including in our buildings. This is not just about turning off the lights when you leave a room, though that's important. It's about the way buildings are designed, how they are built and how they are operated. In Australia, we expect carbon dioxide emissions from commercial buildings to increase by 150% out to 2050 if we do not take any policy actions. Given that this sector makes up 10% of our total greenhouse gas emissions, change here really matters. What we have to do is set standards at the national level to make buildings more energy efficient. It is in part about mandating minimum energy efficiency standards for new buildings. We have to make energy efficiency a core part of building design across the world. but it is also about running buildings more efficiently. To get more energy efficient buildings, we will need a combination of tougher standards and innovative design and engineering solutions. You have some great examples of what can be achieved right here in Pittsburgh. I understand that the David L. Lawrence Convention Centre, where we will gather for the G20 summit tomorrow, is the largest certified green building in the world, and that the Pittsburgh region has the highest concentration of green buildings in the country. These are good things to be able to talk about. These are great achievements by this local community. Internationally, the United States is taking the lead under President Obama in this area in the Major Economies Forum. He did so when he chaired that forum in Italy in July. And with a scientist of the global standing of Energy Secretary Steve Chu as a key player in driving this work and cities like Pittsburgh taking the lead, I'm sure that we will see real progress in the future. But let us be clear, energy efficiency is one of the great transformational economic opportunities for the future, critical to bringing down emissions, critical also for the generation of new jobs and new industries for the future. But even if we have the most efficient buildings, we are still going to need energy. In 2006, renewable energy met only 7% of global primary energy needs. According to the International Energy Agency, by 2050, 46% of global power will need to come from renewables if we are to meet our target of stabilising global greenhouse gas emissions at 450 parts per million by then. That renewable energy can come from a variety of sources. To reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we need to increase our overall use of each of these sources. There is wide recognition of the need to get on with this, and to get on with it now. And there's wide recognition also of the opportunities that this presents for both developed and developing countries. China is one of the world leaders in wind technology. India has taken enormous steps to create an attractive investment environment for the private sector to invest in solar power. It is estimated that $120 billion was invested in renewable energy worldwide in 2008. Most of this goes to wind power and to solar power. The global capacity of wind power is growing at around 30% per year. Solar too is growing rapidly. In Australia, we have just passed through the Parliament new renewable energy target legislation that will ensure that by 2020, 20% of Australia's total electricity generation will come from renewable sources. We've also committed over $1 billion US to support the construction of up to 4 large-scale solar power stations to connect to our energy grid, a solar project of up to 1,000 megawatts, 3 times larger than the current largest solar power plant in the world in California. Australia does not lack for sunshine. We do not lack for land. In fact, we do not lack for desert. We intend to get on with it. We hope to be able to think big on this question and to do real things that count, to demonstrate the work that can be achieved on the ground and the cost with which such electricity can be delivered into the grid. What we must do across the world is to continue to drive the innovation, share the knowledge about renewable energy, and to accelerate, most critically, the deployment. And to the greatest extent possible, we need to turn renewable energy into both a global public good and a new large generator of business and employment opportunity. The welcome increase in renewable energy does not mean that people will give up on more traditional energy sources. When the cost of carbon pollution is factored into our economies, the cost-benefit analysis changes for many energy sources. The reality is the world won't stop using coal. On the contrary, its share of total energy production is projected to rise out to 2030. Coal consumption is expected to increase 61% between 2006 and 2030. So how do we deal with the challenge of emissions from coal is critical to how we deal overall with climate change. It cannot be ignored. The key to maintaining coal as a viable energy source is capturing and storing the carbon dioxide that is produced when coal is burned. The International Energy Agency estimates that nearly 1/5 of the required emissions reductions could come from carbon capture and storage. The technology exists, but it is new, it can be expensive, and requires regulations to be put in place. The Australian government decided last year that we wanted to enable this technology, so we established the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute. The Institute is tasked with helping realise the goal of 20 large-scale carbon capture and storage projects, by which we mean 500 megawatts and above, in operation by 2020, as committed to by the G8 at the Hokkaido Summit last year. It brings together in one place the key technologies, the expertise and the legal and regulatory frameworks of projects register across the world and the knowledge about financing to make these projects happen. Its mandate is to make carbon capture and storage happen and happen globally. Its membership now stands at 123 governments and organisations, including all 20 of the G20 major economies and all the major energy companies in the world. Off the northwest coast of Australia, we have some of the world's largest natural gas reserves. These reserves have the potential to provide a clean form of energy to customers around the world. But the extraction of the gas produces carbon dioxide. Last week, the Gorgon joint venture, including 2 American companies with a long history of developing Australian resources, Chevron and ExxonMobil, announced that they would build Australia's largest ever gas project. They also announced that in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from its latest expansion, the naturally occurring carbon dioxide contained in the gas will be injected and stored in a reservoir more than 2,000 metres below ground. This is expected to be the world's largest carbon dioxide injection project. It will be a commercial-scale demonstration of CCS technology and will position Australia as a global leader in CCS technology more broadly. It was made possible by the decision of the Australian and Western Australian governments to actively support this project. Carbon sequestration, in fact, was a condition of the project imposed by the Government of Western Australia. The idea for our Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute is to identify other projects around the world that can demonstrate the various applications of the technology across a range of geological storage sites. It will become a repository for knowledge in all relevant areas. We see this as a genuine global institute, a global public good. We established it, we manage it, we are largely funding it, $100 million per annum. We do not own it, but we think the idea, alive in this institute, could be a useful model to help drive not just CCS, but help drive other key climate change technologies as well, including each of the main categories of renewable energy and even energy efficiency. Such institutes could pool the best global knowledge in each field. They can be virtual rather than physical, to convert also the great enabling climate change technologies into a combination of global public goods while also supporting market signals necessary to fuel innovation and investment. And perhaps we could even have some public global competitive pressure to help drive innovation between governments and between institutions. If Australia seeks to be a global leader on carbon capture and storage, drawing together a cooperative consortium from around the world, let's encourage other nations to step up to the plate, to lead similar global public and private consortia in each of the renewables and each of the main technology areas and applications in renewable energy and in energy efficiency. To solve the challenges in developing and in deploying these critical new technologies, we will need to drive the process forward and not just wait for it to happen. On climate change, we need to rapidly harness and deploy these global public goods because the clock is ticking too fast. To conclude, your university here in Pittsburgh is perhaps best known for its science and technology, but I appreciate that the faculty and staff here, like the population of Pittsburgh, is more diverse than that. I would like to put a challenge before all of you, the student body, the faculty, the alumni, and the business community of this great city. We need you all to devote your talents to solving climate change. We need the financial experts, the academics and the practitioners to help deliver the funding solutions we need. We need the lawyers to help develop the legal and regulatory frameworks. We need the scientists and the engineers to do the research and development, the technology, to make the solutions work. We need you all to be innovators. We need policy innovation. We need financial innovation, properly regulated, of course. We need technical innovation. We also need political imagination across the world to make this financial and technological revolution on climate change happen on the ground and happen now. You here in Pittsburgh have a broad canvas to work on and the scope to develop your own solutions. And now I know it's not fair to ask people to do something without offering up something yourself. So I say to you that I'll be doing my absolute best here in Pittsburgh at the G20 and beyond, and at every opportunity in the lead up to Copenhagen, to help build the political will and consensus necessary to bring about a positive outcome for the planet come December. We have used technology before to overcome problems. Developments in genetics in the 1970s led to the Green Revolution and have allowed us to feed a much more populated world. We've eradicated a number of deadly diseases from the face of the earth. Today we need the commitment, personal, national and international, to apply that same dedication to tackling climate change. Pittsburgh has recast itself. Pittsburgh did not bury its head in the sand. Instead, Pittsburgh rose to the challenge of change. Now we need to apply that same spirit of innovation, determination and enterprise across the world to rise to the challenge of climate change. Each one of you is crucial to our combined success. And I ask you, as I ask other leaders around the world, to join us in that challenge. As human beings, we are capable of great creativity, just as we are also capable of great destruction. It is time to summon forth the better angels of our nature, for the challenge is great and the time is short. I thank you.